Hello, everyone. Welcome into Above My Pay Grade. My name's Eric, and you know who's with me today? It's Jack from Nobody Special Finance. How you doing, Jack?
I'm good, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you joining me. And typically, when I don't know about a specific subject, I go over to Jack's channel, and he's 10 times smarter than I am. So he breaks it down in a way that I understand it. That's why I wanted to have him on because there's a couple questions I have for him specifically for government priorities. I did a video yesterday, and it was about governments arguing about what priorities they have since they've reached their debt ceiling. Um, they're now re-arguing about which comes first: Social Security, bond payments, et cetera, et cetera. In my video, my guess is that bonds are always number one, and the reason that is because they can't take on more debt. Now we're getting towards the end of the road where it's, hey, you got to pick and choose. Um, but do you think bonds are priority number one for the government as far as
Uh,
paying interest?
they're pretty high up there. Priority number one, it's hard to say what priority number one is. I can tell you interest on the debt is considered mandatory spending. It's not discretionary spending. All right. Mandatory spending, that is anything that is enacted by law, the government shall pay this. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt are mandatory spending. They have to be paid. So those would get paid first. Discretionary spending is the stuff they would cut if they ever decided to suddenly act like money was a finite resource. Imagine that. Um, so now Social Security is a little interesting because Social Security is paid by mandatory spending, but Social Security is run by the Social Security Administration. So all the people who work for Social Security are paid with discretionary spending. So if we
Hmm.
stop paying all the employees with discretionary spending because we hit the debt ceiling, there's nobody there to send the checks out, which is considered mandatory spending. I don't know what that looks like.
Hmm.
That'd
Yeah.
be
But my thought is, if you don't pay bonds, then you can't. Well, you can, but you're going to have to take out debt at a higher interest rate, and so that's why if there's anybody who has an economic brain on them, uh, I think they would say, "Hey, this is priority number one because we will have to take on more debt, and if we don't pay our bonds, then we're going to either pay a higher interest rate or have nobody interested in buying them." Would
right.
you say that that's true?
Yeah, that would be self defeating if they
Yeah.
did that. And you also have to keep in mind government bureaucrats are political beings, right? So they view everything through the lens of politics, not right, not wrong. Politics is trumps all. So think about what could they cut off first that will give them, they being the government, the most advantage. And I'm going back to the last few times we had government shutdowns and all these ridiculous mental exercises we've gone through a few times. And I think about the lengths that certain government institutions went to make the government shutdown even more difficult. Things like putting up physical barriers at national parks, right? That's something that didn't even happen on days when national parks were closed. They didn't put physical barriers up and block entryway to all the driveways and the exits and parking lots, right? But all of a sudden there's a government shutdown. We have to make a big show of it, so we're actually going to pay people to go put barricades up just to make a big circus act out of the government shutdown. Something we wouldn't do if the park was closed anyway on a normal day, but now we do it because the government's shut down. So they actually went out of their way to create the appearance or to actually inflict more inconvenience on people because it was politically advantageous for them to do so. In particular, one side, I don't want to get too political here, too late, but one side in particular did really well politically in the government shutdowns, and one side did terribly politically with the shutdowns. So the side that went out of their way to inflict more harm to make the shutdown worse, it actually was in their to their advantage to do so. You could
Now,
probably figure out what those sides were if you really
oh
want.
yes, I think unfortunately economics is political now because they can't do math up there. But the thing that I'm thinking of is we're at this crossroads now where your average citizen doesn't pay attention to politics, doesn't pay attention to the economy. They do pay attention to what they pay for.
Yep.
So this political football of being able to spend without consequences has reached a terminus, I think, where it's actually like, hey, if you're going to keep playing this fantasy game where we can afford anything we want, the consequence will be the dollar. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and look no further than Japan right now for what that looks like. Right? Japan has a debt to GDP that's over 230% right now. The Japanese government owes more than 2 years of all their tax revenue. I'm sorry, more than 2 years of their whole economy, all goods and services in their economy, in debt. And more than half of that, almost all of some of it, is held by the Bank of Japan. Their own central bank has had to print the yen to buy the bonds because nobody else is willing to buy them. So we're at the point right now where the whole world is raising their interest rates because inflation. Japan's actually lucky. They've managed to sit out a lot of the inflation. I think mainly because their population is collapsing. It's kind of sad. The birth rate is ridiculously low in Japan. But they can't raise interest rates. If they raise interest rates, their government becomes immediately insolvent. And they're not the world reserve currency. So if they try to print their way out of it, there's actual consequences. And
Hmm.
so far, they've gotten away with it this year because they have a huge stash of dollars. Japan, a lot of people, the common myth is that we owe all this money to China. Japan actually holds more U.S. debt than China does. Japan, the start of this year, had about $1.3 trillion of U.S. treasuries. They have dumped a lot of that. I've heard something to the tune of 200 billion already this year or in the last month or so. So they are dumping their dollars at an extremely rapid pace in order to sell those dollars to prop up the value of their yen because it's the only thing they can do as they're debasing the heck out of their currency to maintain this modern monetary theory. It's not going to work for much longer.
No. So I sent you a chat on one of your videos the other day about federal pensioners like myself. I'm in the military. We have a guaranteed pension for the rest of our life. Um, but one thing I've been thinking through is talking about this fiscal cliff that we're going towards. There's some certain things that will go down with it. Like if the U.S. dollar has issues, I think the U.S. stock market is going to have issues. I think
Mhm.
the economy itself obviously is going to have issues. So I'm thinking, and this is just kind of a thought experiment. Would you recommend people in my shoes, where you have kind of this safety net of a federal pension, and if that federal pension goes away, there's a lot of other bad things happening? Maybe allocating your money slightly differently than somebody who doesn't have a pension, specifically federal, because ours is tied to the success of the U.S. government ultimately. And so if they fail, or at least the dollar does, a lot of other things will. A lot of other investments will. So what I'm thinking is specifically gold, Bitcoin, things the government can't print, real estate. Take a little more risk with investments that you otherwise maybe wouldn't allocate. Maybe you'd allocate more to the U.S. stock market, but since you have this cash coming in for the rest of your life, um, am I making sense at all?
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I refer often to Exeter's pyramid. If you're not familiar with Exeter's pyramid, maybe you could flash it on the screen or something, in editing. I don't know how much post production you're going to do on this one.
Oh,
But
loads.
at the very Exeter's pyramid weighs the amount of risk of a certain asset class, and it's an upside down triangle, an inverted pyramid. At the base is gold, where the smallest amount of dollar value exists, but also the lowest amount of risk. If you own gold as the lowest thing down Exeter's pyramid, you have zero counterparty risk. You own pure money, right? But there's not very much gold. Now, the further up the pyramid you get, the more money there is, but the higher the risk gets. Dollars are above gold. There's more dollars than there is gold, but dollars are a little more risk because dollars are backed by the faith and trust in the U.S. government. I giggle when I say that, but that's considered secure. Above dollars is U.S. Treasuries. Above U.S. Treasuries would be things like stocks. All the way up at the top of Exeter's pyramid is unfunded liabilities. And unfunded liabilities, that's your pensions. Now, a government pension is probably safer than a private sector pension because government pension, right? Companies go belly up all the time. Governments don't go belly up as often as companies do, at least not the U.S. government. I like to say even higher than pensions in Exeter's pyramid is where I would put a lot of cryptocurrencies, not Bitcoin, but cryptocurrencies.
Hmm.
I always joke around about like melon coin. That's my
I'd buy it.
token.
I'd be an
Yeah, oh, yeah,
investor.
yeah. I'd sell you one, but not until, or I'd sell you one for say $10, and then I'd issue myself a few 100 million of them
There you
at
go.
$10 each, and then start borrowing against them.
There
That's
you
how
go.
I'd run Meloncoin. So,
FTX and the Treasury
oh yeah,
both have that in common.
I'd put all that garbage above pensions on Exeter's pyramid, but usually unfunded liabilities are considered the weakest, the least secure. So if you're a pension holder, you know, you're holding an IOU, and you're holding an IOU essentially from Congress, which, is there any more loathsome group of individuals in the world than out in Congress?
Sure.
Maybe, but it's a select few. All
Yes.
right, so I don't consider pensions to be as secure as the people shopping pensions around probably advertise them. Now, I was in a unique position recently. I left my day job and I became a full time YouTuber. So I took my private sector pension with me. I cashed that thing out. I am not going to leave the value
Hmm.
that was in that to sit as an IOU for another 20, 30, 40 years. So I cashed that out. I opened up an IRA, still sitting in largely cash, but I plan to put what I cashed out of my pension into a mix of gold, silver, and Bitcoin. So,
Gotcha.
uh,
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that is federally, I believe our pension comes out of the DoD budget. So if they were to nix that, I wonder how the DoD would be funded, and then how they would get recruiting. But that's a whole nother ball of wax. But um, another time.
now,
But yeah,
interestingly,
go ahead.
I was just reading not too long ago. This is from a website, the Concord Coalition. I don't know how, I haven't verified the source, but they're saying that veterans pension programs are considered mandatory spending, even though defense programs are considered discretionary.
Hmm.
So they do specifically list veterans pensions under mandatory spending.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. Good to know.
Now,
I have
I'd
to
also
look
add
more
that
into that.
mandatory spending makes up like 70% of the federal
Yeah.
budget. So like it's all
Yeah.
mandatory right now.
Yeah. Ultimately, they're going to pit old people and young people against each other in this fight. I think politicians will, because it's going to be, hey, you paid into the Social Security system your whole life, and you may not get the benefit you were promised as much. Or young people, you're going to pay into this for a long time and get nothing. So they're
Are we
going
talking about Obamacare now? Is that what you just did? Did
to.
you just pivot to Obama? Because that's
No,
what they did.
yeah, that and Social Security.
All the young
Um,
people thought they were getting something for free, and then they got the bill, and it's what? This
Psych.
this this wasn't in the brochure.
Yeah, it's in the small print.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, all
But
right.
we're not
Final
doing
question.
politics today. Sorry, man.
Oh, it's very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, my wife always gets on me. She's like, "Don't get political," but I'm like, "Yeah, well,
Oh yeah.
economics is politics."
I get the same. Love you, honey.
All right, final question. So, I always want to leave people on a note of hope, or at least, hey, the reason for the channel. I'm sure the reason for yours is make people better, make their investments better, but also make the world a better place. And looking out into the future, I see the best hope we have for the system we're in is keep it around as long as humanly possible. Meaning, if it crashes overnight, that's when it gets really bad. So if we can kick the can somehow, where it's 10% inflation or whatever, and they advertise for, where it's things aren't really busting at the seams completely, we can have a parallel economy. But some of the things I've seen from central planners, I don't see how it would solve it. So, for instance, central bank digital currencies. I get the idea. I get what they want to do with it, but I don't get how it solves. Trying to think like a evil villain here, how it solves their problem, other than more control in the economy. Because the only way a central bank digital currency would do something different than the dollar is be able to allocate it more like a scalpel than like a sledgehammer, like the dollar. Um, so unless you revalue the debt, I don't see how a central bank's digital currency solves things. So that question, and then what do you see, 5, 10, 20 years down the road? Like, where do you see on the other side of this? Where do you see us going to fix the problem?
So, first of all, let me say on the debt, there is no hope of ever paying back the debt. All right, we will one way or another default on the national debt. It is guaranteed. Now, there's two different ways you can default. Most people say, "Oh my God, a default? What are you crazy? Are you insane? You're a madman." Oh, the whole system will collapse. Yeah, that's true. That's your classic default where we owe money and we can't pay it. Sorry, bankrupt. All right. And down that road lies you go to the bank and your money's not there because your money in the bank is an IOU from the bank. The bank, you made a loan to the bank. You're an unsecured creditor to the bank. And the bank takes your money and they make loans and they hold a little bit of it in reserves. Those reserves are usually parked in something like U.S. Treasuries. So if we do the classic default on the debt, you might say the government goes bankrupt. I don't care, but that means you go bankrupt. You go to the bank, your money's gone. You're left with the clothes on your back, the cash under your mattress, the gold in your walls, or the gold, the midnight garden thing, or your Bitcoin. All right. So that's your classic default. That's one option. Least politically expedient, so it's less likely that we go that route. The other option is we could default via inflation. Yeah, we'll pay you back your $31 trillion, but by the time we pay you back, $31 trillion won't be worth spit. That's what they're doing right now. That's the Japanification trade. That is where we're heading right now. That is every bit as sleazy, as dishonest, and as unethical as it is to just say we can't pay you back. It's the same thing. It's just dressed up and packaged differently, and it's presented as if we're being generous or we're somehow being nicer. It is not. All right. And if you ask me, there's nothing sleazier you can do than rob somebody blind who hasn't even been born yet. Right? If we rob somebody right now, we call it taxes. It's robbing somebody. At least we're robbing somebody who has a vote, has a say in the election, participates in the economy. Someone who isn't even been born yet, 2 generations from now, 3 generations from now, they don't get a vote right now. We're doing it to them. All right. So the default via inflation, they have to pay for it. I think that's even sleazier than not paying our bills right now. So that's my take. Either way, we end up in default, one way or another. Now, as far as the CBDC, that's one possible way they'll kick the can down the road a little bit. And unfortunately, for 99.99% of people, that means untold misery. Because what they'll do with the central bank digital currency, and I just did a video on this. Your timing's great. I just put a video up like an hour ago about this. Central bank digital currency is just demand side communism. That's all it is. Communism and socialism, I lump them together. They're the same thing, so sue me. It's basically government control of the means of production. That's the traditional definition of communism or socialism, depending on which ism you're talking about. All right, government control of the means of production. What a CBDC is government control of the means of demand. It's the same thing. It's communism, just on the other side of the supply-demand equation. Right? Because with a CBDC, the government can say, well, the price of food is getting too expensive. Let's just write some code so the poor people aren't allowed to buy food. We'll just turn off their money. They go to buy food and it doesn't work. Sorry. And it's queued to your Social Security number, your wallet. And better yet, all the people who didn't get a certain treatment, or all the people who attended a certain protest, or all the people who worship a certain way, however they want to do it, whatever group it's fashionably appropriate to hate on at that particular time, they can just turn their money off. And they can, through that procedure, they can limit the demand. And so those people don't have any food, and the price of food hasn't gone up at all. So the people that were favorable towards, they can go buy food for a lower price. Right? It's basically a way to artificially lower demand for goods and services to fight inflation. Now, unfortunately, if you're on the wrong side of that, it ends very poorly for you. And they could also do something like, tie your carbon footprint to it. Oh, you ate meat yesterday and then you went on a long road trip last week. We're not going to let you buy a plane ticket. Your carbon footprint is too high. So we're shutting down your digital wallet. You can't buy a plane ticket. You can't fill your gas tank. You can't buy any meat at the supermarket. Well, John Kerry, he's part of the select few who are doing the important work. I mean, what did he say? It's almost extraterrestrial, right? That they're fighting climate change. So he's got to fly to Davos. We're going to give a little more allocation to John Kerry for fuel so he can take his private jet to Davos. And that's okay. His work is important. And we'll just take some of the fuel allocation from the poors, give it to John Kerry so the price of fuel is unchanged.
Mm.
Boom. I just solved inflation. So what a CBDC is, it's government ownership of the means of demand. It's basically just communism on the other side of the equation. It is a tyrant's dream come true. Every human being, every freedom loving human being in the world should resist it tooth and nail with every ounce of their being.
Do you think there's a potential that we go the opposite direction, where people people see what's going on, and they may not know why, but they know that no matter what the government does, they make the problem worse. And because the only thing I'm thinking is, well, you start with a new currency. That's what you end up having to do, because when people don't trust it, you either have to come out with a new one or use force, one of those two, and the new one has to be backed by something. Do you think that that is a possibility at all?
The new one, I can tell you, the new one won't be backed by anything. Not once they've gone full fiat. They can't back it by anything. Um, Sadly, I mean, I think it's inevitable that the world ends up on some kind of a gold standard, but not with 31 trillion owed.
Hmm.
Not with that debt. That debt has to be defaulted on either via inflation or via classic default before we could have any kind of a backed United States currency. Um, Now you mentioned, what does it look like coming out on the other side of this? And actually, while we were talking, I drew a pendulum here on my notepad. We are somewhere around the 1920s, 1930s on the pendulum. I mean, we are reliving the last century in fast forward. I mean, you start with the end of a conflict that was fought on all these different continents. Then you have a disease, and then you have a period of high inflation, and then you have some wacko comes to power, and the whole world starts burning.
Hmm.
Right? Well, out of that madness came what became known as the Greatest Generation. So we're kind of on the end where the pendulum has swung so far in the wacko direction, and it could probably swing further. I mean, it's the 2020s, folks. Let's not say how much worse could it get.
Don't test
Um,
me.
but
Yeah.
eventually, that pendulum is going to start swinging back, and I'll butcher the phrase, but it's something that says where prosperity breeds weak men breed disaster, disaster breeds strong men, and strong men breed prosperity. And before the feminists jump down my neck, I'm just quoting the phrase here. I'm not saying women cannot be great either. You girls, you're great. I love you. But I do think whether it's our kids, is it the Gen Zers, is it the generation that comes after, there will be another greatest generation that sorts this out. I would like it to be the Gen Xers. I'd like us to be the ones who clean it up so my kids don't have to deal with this stuff. I
Yeah.
don't know that we're going to pull that off. I would like
Hmm.
to.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of people don't know what's coming. They're starting to feel the pain, and they keep working harder, and still less to show for it. So that's why I'm a big advocate of the things you talked about: silver, gold, Bitcoin. Because if we can't fix it at this level, at least you can say to your kids, you have something to show for it. Like you can maybe hand them down something that's valuable instead of
Yeah.
worthless paper or fire starter.
Well,
Um,
you're
Go
doing the
ahead.
right thing. What you're doing, the message you're getting out. People that are watching your channel, they're learning about this. The average person in the United States still doesn't understand that when the stimulus showed up in their mailbox in 2020 and 2021, that they were being robbed. They still haven't figured that out. I think the reality of inflation, maybe they're starting to figure out, hey, that $600 check or that accelerated child tax credit payment that the stimmies in the mailbox. I'm starting to think maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Maybe we shouldn't have made that deal because they were being robbed. They were having thousands of dollars in value stolen out of their savings and their retirement or their future quality of living. And in exchange, they were getting a few $100s put in their mailbox and they were being told, you're welcome. So it starts with financial literacy. Teach your kids financial literacy, and hope for the best.
Yeah, the one question I ask those people that don't really think about it much, the one question I ask them is, why don't we just hand out $100,000? Because they have a brake pedal in their mind, and so 6,000 seemed okay, but 100,000, and so I ask them why. Why is 100,000 not okay? And then they're on the right road at that point because they're like, oh, okay, okay. So
I
and
would ask them, wouldn't we all be millionaires if we made the
right,
minimum wage $100,000? And they
yeah,
would say, well, no, we wouldn't. I'd say, well, yes, we would, but millionaire wouldn't mean anything.
correct, correct.
Then they
Um,
start to, you see the gears start to turn. You
right,
got to give them a nudge, but eventually they get turning.
yeah, and yeah, I've been reading The Death of Money. It's about Weimar, and
On my list, I haven't gotten to it yet, but it
it's
is.
it's kind of dry, but it is interesting. Like what people were. That's what the interesting part is. What people were thinking,
Yep.
and it's very similar to today, which is also kind of scary. And
And
fun
it
fact,
wasn't that book's not meant as an instruction manual to any congressional leaders that are
neither is
watching right now. It's a
1984.
cautionary tale, not a
Yes,
manual.
yeah, 1984 is not supposed to be an instruction
Yeah.
manual either. And
Let's make
man,
1984 fiction again.
correct. Fun fact about Davos, if you didn't know, they actually don't have a runway there. So people have to fly into a different town and then take a helicopter to Davos. So it's double greenhouse gases
Well,
for
I
these
mean,
folks.
if it's for the climate, any whatever's necessary, please.
Best way to fix
I
the
hope
climate
it's
is
a comfortable
communism.
helicopter ride. I'd hate to think it was a bumpy ride.
All right, man. Well, hey, I appreciate your time. Thanks for answering my questions. And I'm pretty sure people know where to follow you. But if they don't, I will link his channel in the description below. I will see y'all in the next one. Peace.